Welcome. This is Stephen Lee, and this is Life and the Living of It. I haven't posted an episode in quite a while, which is somewhat unlike me. But I've had a period in my life of a little bit of trauma and being triggered, and a little bit of anxiety. Which brings me to the subject of this podcast. I want to talk about trauma and anxiety. And I was wondering, how exactly do I do this without triggering someone's anxiety or trauma? I also wanted to find a definition of trauma that wasn't more confusing. In my search for definitions, there are so many that are either too clinical or those that are too emotional, those that are too objective, those that are too subjective, those that require quite a bit of explanation. The basic definition that I'm going with is trauma is about being stuck where the body feels threatened. And from this, once the body is threatened, the emotions change. Once the emotions changed, the way we think changes. But I really do feel that trauma begins when we feel stuck in feeling that our body is threatened. And what I mean by stuck is the same things that caused the body to be threatened originally may no longer be around, except that there are triggers that bring us back to the time and the place, the bodily sensations of when that original danger, threat was present. And somehow we can't get out of this particular cycle of being triggered and going back to that time and place and feelings in our normal everyday life. This is what it means to have a trauma or an unresolved trauma. The other problem with speaking about trauma is that every person has a different trauma response. For example, one of my friends could not understand why she would get these blinding headaches if she sat on her leather ottoman. She got checked out for allergies. She got checked out by a neurologist even. And yet when she sat in a leather ottoman, her leather ottoman, that she inherited from her father, she would get these blinding headaches. She didn't realize until after quite a few months of trauma therapy that that ottoman was a trigger because she found her dad unconscious on the ottoman and called 911, and her dad actually had a stroke and eventually died. So for her, not only was it a reminder physically, because she could smell the leather, she could feel the cushion, it was also the placement, it was the feeling of that ottoman against her body. All of this triggered her grief, her very complex grief, that had not been addressed yet. And it created, instead of grief and instead of outward signs of, shakiness or deep breathing or even a panic attack, it created these intense headaches. But once she was aware of this, then she could use tools to, another person may hear a song that they haven't heard for years and suddenly feel like they can't breathe, like the world is rushing in on them. These are all trauma triggers, and sometimes it's very difficult to find out what the trauma trigger is. Usually it's something that has been associated with the memory of when the body did originally feel threatened. And again, people's responses to being triggered are very different. Some trauma triggers trigger extreme exhaustion. Some trigger headaches. Some trigger panic attacks. Some trigger a sudden sense of itchiness, like ants are crawling over your body. Some trigger kind of a fugue state where you're not aware of your surroundings for a little while. The thing with these triggers, though, is that if the underlying root of the trauma hasn't been addressed, hasn't been in some way brought to the surface, examined, if some body work has not been done, systematic desensitization, EMDR, which we'll talk about a little later, different tools that kind of interrupt that body trauma response, then we, and I'm talking about myself as well, are stuck living with these cycles of trauma that, one, we don't understand fully, and two, take away from the quality of our life. Let's get into what some traumatic events may be. Usually a traumatic event is characterized by 4 different things. There's a threat to the body, a threat of annihilation, a threat of harm, a threat of death. The second characteristic is that it feels inescapable and unmanageable. The third is that this perception is grounded in a real event. Something real, tangible happens. And last, this traumatic event may have happened to an individual. It may have happened to a family, a community, and it may be generational. For the sake of this podcast, we're going to talk about individual. Very briefly, I want to talk about how trauma is different than a memory. Trauma is remembered more non-verbally and more emotionally than as a particular detailed event. For example, if someone is triggered and they get this vague sense of foreboding, but they don't really understand where that comes from. Or if someone is extremely frightened of small dogs, but they don't have a specific memory that might account for it. Trauma also shows up as something that's happening right now. It's held present. It's not narrative. It's not a story. It's as if a fire alarm has gone off in the body. It is happening now. So how can we really tell when a trauma has been triggered? This is difficult because everyone is a little different in what triggers them, to what extent it triggers them, when and where, with whom. So this takes a little professional sleuthing to figure out, but also you can take an inventory of your normal everyday behaviors, feelings. Journaling is kind of a good way to get a grasp of what your normal everyday life is like. And then looking for times when that normal emotional background, the emotional consistency, stops or is altered or suddenly changes. And then you have to look around for, well, what did you feel? When did you feel it? Who was around you? What was happening? What were you sensing with all of your senses? Sight, smell, sound, touch, feel. And it's very difficult to do this, especially if you're in the middle of being triggered, especially if you're in the middle of a panic attack. And after the attack or after the trigger has happened, and you feel sort of back to baseline again, sometimes writing about the event, getting as much detail as you can, might be a good idea, or talking over the event. But if you can't do that, if the trauma is such that even thinking about the trauma brings back a lot of fear and anxiety, that's really when you need to get some professional help. Really when you need to go into EMDR or cognitive behavioral therapy, or someone who can help you make sense out of what you're feeling. Now, how therapists and professionals help to uncover this stuff is that first they try to place you in a place that you feel safe, secure. Now, I want to talk a little bit about EMDR therapy. EMDR stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. Now, that's a mouthful. So let me tell you about a couple of sessions that I had with EMDR. The typical therapy, the therapist brings up emotionally disturbing material in very brief, sequential sessions, while they focus, or I focus, on external stimuli. For me, this was taking out a yellow ball attached to a telescoping antenna. And as I was talking about briefly, the last time that I felt out of control in my life, she would be waving this yellow puffy ball in front of my eyes and be asking me to train my eyes on this ball. At the same time, she had me tap my hands, one hand with one rhythm and the other hand with another rhythm. Now, this was so new and bizarre and, frankly, a little hilarious that I had a hard time taking it seriously. And yet, I found that between the beginning of the session and her asking me what's the level of anxiety, what's the level of fear, that if I started out with a 7.5, one of the times I felt out of control was when I was caught in a riptide and I thought I would drown, to the end of the session where it was about a 3, I had to question, something happened. Something happened between the beginning and the end. So if following a spongy yellow ball and clapping my hands against my legs in different rhythms were going to make this much of a difference to a traumatic memory, I was all in. What's actually happening, it's a little bit of a mystery. But during EMDR, when alternate rhythms or something that captures the stimuli, especially the eyes, is added to a narrative or a reflection in brief amounts of a time in which a trauma occurred or something that causes pain, or even coming in and one day I had a headache and she said, well, let's go through the headache with EMDR. And the headache went from about an 8 to about a 2. But what this seems to do is, with external stimuli during the time that you're recalling a time of fear and anxiety and trauma, the brain seems to resynchronize that this trauma happened in a time, in a place. It contextualizes it rather than making trauma being felt as if it's happening now. It's as if the external stimuli, the other patterns, the other rhythms that are applied during therapy are kind of like a metronome and a calendar. So that while the body experiences the anxiety, the mind reintegrates the body's experiences with the memories of the time and the place when it originally happened. Now, it does this at small moments at a time. It's very unlikely one session with EMDR is going to solve everyone's trauma. It's an incremental process, but it does slowly reintegrate what happened in the past with staying in the past. For example, in the times that I was bullied as a child, I went from feeling like I was bullied right now. My body could almost feel the punches to my stomach, to, oh, that happened to when I was 6 years old. And me as an adult now would have a very different response. Part of EMDR is also acting out the actions that at the time of the trauma, at the time of being out of control, at the time of feeling one is in danger, that we couldn't work out. So in the case of the bullying, it was actually going through the motions of pushing the bully away. So my therapist would get the pillows out and she'd brace herself. And she says, push me all the way across the room. And then following the ball on the stick and doing some hand tapping, it really did reduce how much fear and anxiety would come up when I thought about that memory, because I was completing an action that I was denied doing, either out of fear or physical incapability at the time. There are several therapies for trauma and several types of trauma therapists out there. And if you do feel that you are occasionally triggered or you feel you sometimes have out of proportion fears or anxieties or responses to things that you can't really track down, or somehow you have more fear or generalized anxiety that seems to be taking away from the quality of your life, or you actually do have panic attacks, these are the times to really see a professional. And everyone doesn't respond to EMDR the same way. Everyone doesn't respond to cognitive behavioral therapy or family system dynamic therapy the same way. But do find somebody. You might have to go through a couple of professionals before you find one that either has the right techniques or someone with whom you trust more. Because what I can tell you in my 2.5 years of therapy is I went from being a person who easily became anxious and did have some serious panic attacks from time to time to one who has perhaps only 12% of what I used to have every day. The main point is almost every trauma that people have lived through can be helped, which means there is almost always hope for making our lives better, richer, and less traumatic. And this is life and the living of it.